Good day or good evening, however we find you. Welcome to the 13th episode of Creation, Genesis, and Origins. My co-host Ken Miller is with me. I'm Dick Fisher. In 1928-29, Leonard Woolley excavated the ancient city of Ur in southern Mesopotamia. It had once been a thriving Sumerian port city situated on the Persian Gulf. The buildup of silt over centuries moved the coastline south, and now the long-abandoned ancient ruins lie many miles inland. In the hot desert sun and swirling dust, Woolley's grimy crews stabbed their spades time and again, digging deeper and deeper, filling their buckets with loose desert sand. The graves of the kings of Ur, Woolley called them, yielded their treasures of precious trinkets one by one. Cups and goblets, vases and jugs, lyres and harps, gold, bronze, and silver pieces of adornment and useful tools such as this sledge were excised from rooms lined by walls of stone. Grisly skeletons were wrested from their dark resting places and brought to searing sunlight. In the summer of 1929, toward the end of their season, Woolley's native digging crews made one last probe, a little deeper than the last plundered grave, to see what was in store for the following year. They found more pieces of artifacts, much to their pleasure, beneath the foundations of the lowest tomb. Encouraged by these finds, Woolley next wanted to know how far down they had to go before the treasure trove would end. Shafts were sunk carefully, sand and debris were brought up for close examination. Woolley had dated the lowest tomb to 2800 BC. Now, inch by inch and bucket by bucket, he was traveling back in time. Clay tablets started appearing among the loose debris. The inscriptions bore characters deemed to be even older than the previous finds. He had reached 3000 BC by his reckoning, and with appetites whetted afresh, still there was more to come. Shafts were sent down deeper still. At last the floor was reached. The journey had ended, and they stood at the bottom. Or so they thought. Then Woolley noticed the soil had changed from sand to clay. Upon close examination, Woolley determined that the clay had once been dissolved. What was water-laid clay doing in the middle of a desert beneath these tombs? His first thoughts were that the clay layer must have been set down when the Euphrates River overflowed its banks, sometime long before civilization had begun. Yet the elevation seemed too high for that. His next step was to measure the depth of the layer of clay. To his amazement, nearly 10 feet of clay was discovered before reaching another level of civilization beneath the clay layer. Once again, artifacts were brought to the surface for scrutiny. Another discovery was made. The bits and pieces of pottery were uneven, a sign that they were made by human hands alone, unaided by the potter's wheel. These painted potsherds were from a civilization even more primitive than the ones he had already uncovered, and later were identified as Ubaid. Mud bricks and even kiln-baked bricks were found at this level. Woolley reasoned that two dissimilar civilizations separated by 10 feet of water-laid clay could mean only one thing. An ecstatic Woolley reached a conclusion and sent a telegram that electrified the world of 1929. "We have found the flood," announced a nebulant Woolley. Elated by his find, Woolley encouraged excavators at other sites to look for flood layers. Sure enough, flood layers, or more cautiously, sterile stratum, of various thicknesses were found. At last, thought Woolley, archaeology had established firm evidence for what had long been a controversial Bible story, the Great Flood.
But that euphoric feeling was not to last. This chart lists the cities that were excavated, where flood deposits were found at the top with dates on the left. Dating archaeological digs in the absence of deposits of volcanic ash lacks the kind of precision archaeologists prefer, but nevertheless, using sedimentation rates, the thick flood stratum Woolley found at was placed at the early 4th millennium, about 3800 BC. Notwithstanding, a higher flood level was also uncovered, dated to about 2700 BC, but it was discounted as too little and too late.
Stephen Langdon and L.C. Waddelen excavated Kish in 1928-29. They dated the bottom layer, which amounted to about 1 foot in thickness, to 3300 BC. This seemed to lend support to Woolley's claim, even though the dates were 500 years apart. The thickest layer at Kish was at a higher level, however, and assigned a date somewhat closer to the thinner layer found at Max Mallowan, who excavated the more northern city of Nineveh, uncovered several strata of mud and riverine sand, totaling 6 feet in depth. Diplomatically, he called this not a flood, but a pluvial interval, and placed it at the 4th millennium, similarly dated to Woolley's lowest layer. But then flood deposits at Kish, Shuruppak, Uruk, and Lagash were considered, and a consensus put all these layers at nearly 1,000 years later than Woolley's renowned find, averaging around 2900 BC. This prompted a debate turning on who had uncovered the biblical flood, the most important flood in human history, and had left Woolley in a bit of a quandary. After all, he had wasted a lot of time and energy if his trumpeted flood deposit was from the wrong flood. As it turned out, the flood layer Woolley thought was from Noah's flood was dated too early in relation to the other sites, while the higher layer he had discounted, that was dated closer to the flood layers from the other sites, seemed puny by comparison. Ironically, the lower, earlier, and thicker layer Woolley thought was from the flood resulted apparently from merely a flood, and conversely, the higher layer and thinner layer he thought was from only a flood may have been left by the flood. Such is the life of an archaeologist who goes public a bit too early.
The importance of dating and the distribution of the flood deposits at the 6 city sites cannot be overlooked. Nineveh is the most northerly city, and according to Genesis, was not settled by Semites until Asher led the expedition in the post-flood era, Genesis 10:11 in the King James Version.
At the time of 3800 BC, was still an Adiabene city on the Persian Gulf, which became a Sumerian city later on. The local floods at these two sites, and Nineveh, would have had devastating effects on the local populations, but neither city was likely to have experienced any migrations from Adam's generations at such early dates. The cities that bore the brunt of a massive flood all at the same time, around 2900 BC, were the middle cities of southern Mesopotamia, which would have contained Adamite populations. Jemdet Nasser artifacts were separated by early dynastic remains, both at Shuruppak and Uruk, by water-laid clay deposits 2 feet and 5 feet thick, respectively. What may seem odd at first is that no flood layer was found at Eridu, which may have experienced flooding, or it may have been spared. Eridu was the southernmost city located on the Persian Gulf at that period, roughly 20 miles from the Euphrates. Water from the flood may have drained directly into the Gulf, bypassing Eridu. Also, Adamite populations likely migrated north by then, settling at Erech and elsewhere, as indicated by the Adapa fragment and reflected in the change of pottery styles recovered at Eridu. As retribution for the sins of Adam and his descendants, the flood may have involved little more territory than that which contained Adamite populations. Nineveh, which had experienced no Semitic migrations at this early date, and maybe even Eridu as well, could have been outside the boundaries of Adamite settlements at the time of the flood. Of equal importance to the finding and dating of the flood deposits connected with Kish, Shuruppak, Uruk, Lagash, and possibly Ur is the total absence of flood layers found anywhere else in the Near East. What has been hard for many to accept is that the flood of Noah's day was entirely local to southern Mesopotamia. According to John Bright, a number of sites in Mesopotamia of equal or greater antiquity have been excavated down to virgin soil, and no evidence of flooding came to light at them. Perhaps the most important of these is Eridu, located only 7 miles away from Ur. Equally serious is the fact that no site in Syria or Palestine, where archaeologists were equally active during the early part of the present century, has yielded a flood layer. In these two countries, some of the oldest towns in the world have been excavated and show no evidence of a flood.
There is solid archaeological evidence to support a date of 2900 BC for the flood and enough literary evidence to believe Noah's Ark was built in the city of Shuruppak, modern Farah, in Iraq as the site where the Ark was built and from where it floated off to begin its historic voyage. So where did it land?
The landing site has been the subject of dispute for centuries. Ancient reports of Ark sightings abounded from Berosus, the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Targums, Josephus, Nicholas of Damascus, Hippolytus, Eusebius, Faustus of Byzantium, Epiphanius, Isidore of Seville, Eutychus, among others, covering from 400 BC to the 13th century AD. Modern reports, some suspicious, have occurred up until today, and likely more will come. Over the centuries, 8 different landing places have been designated. Most of these legendary resting sites center around 3 locations that have gained prominence: Mount Ararat, Agri Dagh in Turkey, northeast of Lake Van; Mount Cudi, Judi Dagh or Jebel Judi, southwest of Lake Van near Cizre, Turkey; and the Adiabene region below Mosul and south of the Little Zab River in either Iraq or Iran. Many Christians have come to believe the Ark rested atop the 17,000-foot tall extinct volcano known as Mount Ararat, also called Agri Dagh or Massus. Other candidates include Pir Omar Gudron, a low-lying mountain in the Zagros range that lies east of the Tigris and south of the lower Zab River, in either Iran or Iraq in the Kurdish region of Kirkuk. Further south and west is the Adiabene region of Iran in the Kermanshah province, which has also been considered a possible landing site. The annals of King Ashurbanipal II of Assyria placed the Ark on Mount Nasir somewhere in this region. Another possibility is Jebel Judi or Judi Dagh in a mountain range, partly composed of Cudi limestone from the Jurassic Cretaceous period, rising above the Cizre plain. Located approximately 200 miles from Mount Ararat and southwest of Lake Van, just east of Cizre, Turkey, Jebel Judi stands barely inside the northern boundary of Mesopotamia. Von Kirkjian wrote a history of Armenia. In it, he says, "It has long been the notion among many Christians that Noah's Ark came to rest as the flood subsided upon the great peak known as Mount Ararat. This assumption is based on an erroneous reading of the 4th verse of the 8th chapter of Genesis. That verse does not say that the Ark landed upon Mount Ararat, but upon the mountains of Ararat. Now, Ararat was the Hebrew version of the name, not of the mountain, but the country around it. The old Armenian homeland, whose name at other times and in other tongues appears variously as Ararat, Urartu, etc. The prophet Jeremiah, writing in 600 BC, speaks of the kingdom of Ararat, which kingdom at that time called itself Urartu. Hence, the mountains of Ararat may mean any part of the tangled mountain mass of the country. The Armenians never called the colossus of the range Ararat. To them that mighty peak was Massus. And we can add to that, the Hebrew word for mountains and hills is the same. So it could have been translated the hills of Armenia, which could place the ark anywhere north or east of southern Mesopotamia.
At the beginning of the Christian era, Ararat came to be understood in terms of the geography of that day. A smaller district on the Araxes became Ararat, rather than the larger ancient kingdom of Urartu. Thus, an ancient volcano in this area, Agri Dagh, rising majestically from the plain of the Araxes to nearly 17,000 feet, came to be called Mount Ararat and associated with the flood. In recent years, archaeologists have traipsed up mountains over 10,000 feet in elevation, searching for the landing spot for Noah's Ark. Ice-capped Agri Dagh, Painful Mountain in Turkey, now called Mount Ararat by Europeans and Massus by the Armenians, has been inspected repeatedly, while the more promising mountains and foothills further south and east largely have been ignored.
Armenia converted to Christianity in the 4th century. An alphabet was introduced by the 5th century AD, and the Bible could then be translated into Armenian. When Armenians read Genesis in their own Bible, their understanding appears to be at variance with what the writers of Genesis intended. Once the Armenians believed the famous ark was located within their borders, ark stories began to flourish. Armenian literature from the 5th through the 10th centuries AD said nothing of an ark. It was not until the 13th century that ark legends began to appear, and these stories became popular by the 14th century. Perhaps the earliest Mount Ararat account can be attributed to William of Rubric, circa 1210 to 1270 AD, who launched a mission to the Mongols in the hope of converting them to Christianity. Near the city called Nakshua, known today as Natshivan, he wrote, "Near this city are mountains in which they say that Noah's Ark rests, and there are 2 mountains, the one greater than the other, and the Araxes flows at their base. And there is a town there called Semimum, which interpreted means 8, actually Arabic for 80, not 8. And they say that it was thus called from the 8 persons who came out of the ark, and who built it on the greater mountain." As Christianity flourished over the centuries, Mount Ararat in Turkey became the landing spot du jour, without regard to how a boat could have gotten there, crossing 2 mountain ranges, or even paying close attention to the Genesis narrative itself.
One of those caught up in repeating the myths of others was Nicholas de Nicolay, 1517 to 1583, appointed by the King of France as court geographer, who by 1558 had finished a trip to Turkey. In his account, he included a section about Armenia. In this region, as Isidore says, is the Mount Ararat, otherwise called Mount Gordian, upon the top whereof rested and remained the Ark of Noah after the great deluge ceased.
James Bryce was famous for climbing Mount Ararat and reaching the summit. In his presentation to the Royal Geographical Society in 1878, he downplayed the idea that the ark came to rest upon the legendary mountain with which he was well acquainted. Bryce reminded his audience that the ark only rested in a district which the Hebrew knew as Ararat or Armenia. He further explained the rationale behind the legends that placed the ark on this particular mountain. At the same time, our mountain is so very much higher, more conspicuous, and more majestic than any other summit in Armenia, that one could hardly doubt that if the Bible writer had any particular mountain present to his mind, it must have been our Mount Ararat. No one who'd ever seen it could have doubted that the ark rested anywhere in that part of the world. It rested upon that particular summit. It is so much higher, so much more isolated, so much more imposing than any other, that it is just the place where an ark ought to rest.
In other words, it was the very idea that the flood was global to begin with, coupled with this magnificent mountain dominating the landscape, which made it the logical choice.
Our biblical rationale for the ark having come to perch atop the highest mountain stems from Genesis 8:5, where the tops of mountains were not seen for some time after the ark landed. Had the word hills been used, it would have aided our understanding somewhat. Furthermore, the Ararat construct, which includes the two stratovolcanoes, Great Ararat and Little Ararat, cuts across geologic formations from the Devonian, Permo-Carboniferous, Cretaceous, Eocene, and Miocene periods. These volcanoes erupted roughly 20 million years ago, punching their way through sedimentary rock containing fossils dating to the respective eras. Vast lava flows from Miocene time to the present cover many of the older sedimentary rocks.
Had the ark landed on this particular volcanic precipice, then the fossils contained in the stratified sedimentary layers beneath could not have been laid down during the flood. So ironically, the idea that the fossil record was sequenced by Noah's flood, as espoused by young Earth creationists, would be thoroughly discredited if it could be proved Mount Ararat was the landing site.
Both Akkadians and Sumerians identified Shuruppak as the home of the flood hero in the legends of Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, and Ziusudra, in agreement with the Sumerian king list. If Shuruppak, where Noah embarked on his voyage, presumably, can be corroborated with other relevant inscriptions, why not give a measure of credibility to the ark's designated landing site as well? Mount Nasir is mentioned twice in the Gilgamesh epic as the location where the ark landed.
Scholars disagree on the exact location of Mount Nisr, but two approximate areas are prominent, which we will examine in the next episode.
Genesis 8:4 says the ark landed upon the mountains of Ararat. First, the Hebrew word har, translated mountains in this text, also means hills. And the Hebrew Ararat is the Sumerian Arata, also known as Urartu, roughly corresponding to the area of Armenia today. In 2 Kings and Isaiah, the same Hebrew word is translated Armenia. So the biblical text is not specific, and the 17,000-foot Agri Dagh in Turkey, known as Mount Ararat, would be an extremely unlikely candidate.
Only in a global flood context does Mount Ararat become even a remote possibility, which may indeed provide motivation for perpetuating Agri Dagh as the landing site. In a flood confined to the Mesopotamian plain, this mountain becomes the most unlikely of theoretical locations where the ark could have come to rest.
Numerous difficulties would have arisen had the ark landed on such a huge mountain. Getting the animals down the snow-capped precipice would be an enterprise, and then redistributing them around the globe to their former homes would be a nightmare. Kangaroos and koala bears back to Australia, aye-ayes and other lemurs back to Madagascar, buffaloes and coyotes back to America, etc. Talk about a job for a good travel agent.
There are mountain barriers standing between Mesopotamia and the Ararat Range. Nothing resembling a boat of any kind has been documented atop Mount Ararat. Even eyewitnesses' accounts of the ark-like structures can be explained as volcanically produced basalt outcroppings that can, in the right light, resemble a barge. The Genesis text, using the plural mountains or hills, identifies no particular mountain, but points generally toward Armenia, which broadly embraces that region north and east of Mesopotamia.
In conclusion, if you have booked a tour to Turkey to climb a 17,000-foot snow-capped mountain to search for relics from the ark, I would try to get my money back. Bill Krause found a bit of wood with bitumen on it dated to an early era near the foot of Jebel Judi and held a press conference saying he had found the famous ark. But it was common practice to waterproof boats with tar in ancient times, and it could have come from any boat. Bitumen still to this day is produced at Hit, located on the Euphrates River, some 80 miles west of Baghdad. Virtual lakes of thick petroleum well up from deep faults. This petroleum is then packed into reed baskets and floated in barges down the Euphrates. One consideration for a landing spot would be that it needed to be in a remote location. The entire faithful remnant, the sum total of Adam's generations, had been reduced to just 8, including the wives of Noah and his 3 sons. There is safety in numbers, they say, and Noah's family had no numbers to defend against potential hostiles. They needed seclusion and time to reconstitute. Only a remote location would suffice, far distant from the Sumerian population, which may have survived in great numbers. Also, a flood confined to the area around the Euphrates basin presents real problems for a vessel trying to sail north towards a rising elevation. Perhaps with a sail attached, or with oars, or by using punting poles, as mentioned in the legend of Gilgamesh, and as depicted in the cylinder seal recovered from Uruk, or possibly even drawn by donkeys. The ark could find itself resting comfortably in the foothills of Armenia. In our next episode, we will look at more promising landing sites and the dispersion of Noah's kin in Genesis 10. Thanks to my co-host, and thank you for watching.